If you will turn in your Grow, Pray, Study Guide or look at the front page of it, you'll see our scripture readings from today. They are selections from both Exodus 3 and Exodus 14, a story that may be familiar to many of us from the Exodus of the people of Israel. First, I'll start with the selection from 3 and we'll move to 14. Hear now these words. The Lord said to Moses, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And we know that Moses did indeed go to organize the Exodus. And on the night of their escape, in great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, what have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone, and let us serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. The angel of God, who was going before the Israelite army, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. Then Moses stretched out his hands over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. The waters returned and covered the chariots and chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained, but the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day. This is the word of God for the people of God. Today we're going to talk a little bit about directions. So just wonder if you want to think to yourself, how good am I at directions? Now that's not let me be clear. I don't want you to think, how good is Beth at directions, because I know I'm not good. I want you to think about that for yourself. How good are you at directions? Maybe. Some people are really good at directions. Maybe you're a person who drives by like the mileage distance and you look for street signs and you know when to turn because you're looking for the name. Maybe you're a person who drives by landmarks, so you know you're going to turn at the covered bridge and then at the old oak tree and things like that. Maybe you are like Celia and you can't read a map at all. Maybe you are a millennial. Lucy was talking about millennials this morning. Maybe you're a millennial and you drive by GPS only. Some of us who aren't millennials do that too, probably. But Celia is definitely, my 26-year-old daughter, she's definitely a millennial. She drives by GPS. She does not remember how to get from one place to another, ever. She just plugs the address in and she follows the voice. And it takes her where she wants to go. I remember when she had been driving for a good while and she was going to her grandparents' house. And they had lived in the same house since she was 1. And I said to her, how many times does it take you to go to your grandparents' house until you remember how to get there? And she said, I don't have to remember how to get there. I'm never going to remember how to get there. I just plug it in and I go. I want to propose today that maybe those folks, maybe the millennials, have a little something going for them that us older folk could catch on to and use. A trust in an unseen voice to get us safely to our destination. And here's the thing. Zoe may not know how to read a map, but she has never failed to arrive at her destination when she has followed that GPS. Even if it took her what I consider to be the long way. You know what I mean by that? Because you know that sometimes when you plug something into your GPS, for no apparent reason, it takes you not the normal route or the most direct route, but it will take you some other way before you get where you're going. And I don't know why it does that. It's my voice on my GPS, she never tells me why, but I think that maybe she knows something that I don't know, like maybe there's a road closure up ahead that I don't know about, or some danger up ahead that I might not be looking out for. And so she takes me a different way. And if I just follow and trust, I will get there. She can get me there. Well, today we are picking up in our series, long story short, working our way through the arc, the narrative arc of the Bible in 8 weeks. And we're in week number 3. Last week we learned about the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And we learned a little bit about how jealousy and trickery were a large part of that narrative from our patriarchs. And I told you that Jacob had many children and that we would talk a little bit about his youngest son, his favorite, Joseph, of Technicolor Dreamcoat fame. He was the youngest, and all of his brothers, with that many kids in the household, 12 kids in the household, there's going to be some more jealousy and trickery, right? It's not going to end with the patriarchs. It's going to move down the family chain, and you guessed it. He's his father's favorite, and that causes some tension with his brothers. So they're jealous, and they decide, well, we'll just sell him into slavery. Good plan. Just great plan for them. And so off they send him to Egypt. Slavery in Egypt. They tell their father that he's died. And there he is in Egypt. But Joseph grows in stature even in Egypt, and he rises to the highest position in Pharaoh's court. Over time, there comes a famine in the land. And so all of Joseph's family, they move to Egypt. And they live as aliens in the land. In Egypt, Joseph's family, our ancestors, the Israelites, they grow rapidly. Their numbers increase, and over time, there is a large population of Israelites living in Egypt. Joseph is on his deathbed, and he makes his family swear to him a promise, an oath, that they will return to the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to them. We pick up today in Exodus. It starts more than 400 years after Joseph's death, and there's been leadership changes, as you know, there would be over 400 years' time, and the Israelites have grown in number, and the new Pharaoh is pretty threatened by that. And so he leads a campaign to subdue them, and he does it through slavery. Most of us know at least something about this story. Maybe we know it thanks to Cecil B. DeMille and the Ten Commandments, and we watch that on Easter. Or maybe we know it because of DreamWorks and The Prince of Egypt, a movie that a lot of kids watch and learn about this story. We know that Moses is saved by the Pharaoh's daughter, born an Egyptian, a Hebrew, and floated out into the water, and that Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and he grows up in the palace. But he knows that he is a Hebrew, and as an adult, he witnesses an Egyptian beating one of the slaves, and he murders him. And so he runs off. Where does he run? He runs to Midian. He runs to Midian. He finds a wife. He begins a family business with her family as a shepherd. And that is where God finds him. In a bush on fire. God comes to him and says what we heard this morning, I have heard the cries of my people. I have come to rescue them. God has heard the cries of the people who are enslaved, and God recruits Moses to lead them out of the land and take them back to the promised land. Moses eventually does what God has called him to do, and he gathers the people up. He gathers the Israelites and he leads them to the waters of the sea. And as we read this morning, God does a mighty work and opens the sea, and they walk across, they escape on dry land. And it's 3 months later when they arrive at Mount Sinai, where God again does a mighty work, and he gives them tablets. He gives them general, ethical, behavioral instructions for how to live their lives in this new wilderness place where they are wandering, trying to make their way to the promised land. God gives them laws regarding worship and sacrifices and social justice and personal property and how to conduct themselves with one another and with God. God's covenant will remain with the people as they live according to God's commands. But just as Jacob, their patriarch, had wrestled with God, so they too, they wrestle and they struggle with God and this new way of living. They struggled with this new life of moving forward. And they wondered, not just to themselves, but out loud, they spoke it to Moses and they speak it again. Maybe we should just go back. Let us just go back to the way things were. The way things were was better than the way things are now. They grumbled and they moaned and they whined and they complained. Anything is better than this wilderness wandering. They even erected a golden calf and called out to old gods to see if those gods would relieve their suffering. But along the way, all along the way, God was faithful to them. And their grumbling and complaining, God provided every day for them water to drink and manna from heaven to satisfy their hunger. And the people cried out. God did what God had done before. God answered and provided a solution. Maybe you know about this syndrome called the yes but syndrome. The syndrome goes something like this. Even if you don't know my name, I bet you know it by experience. Someone says to another person, oh my gosh, here's my problem, and files some complaints about, what's happening, and the person listening responds with some solutions. Here's something that you could do about that. But the answer comes back, yes, but. And behind that, yes, but, is the shooting down of all of those possible solutions that might provide a way to move forward out of whatever kind of trouble there is. It's basically a negating of every solution that gets offered. And as I was reading this week through the Exodus, I thought, the Israelites are pretty good yes, but people. They're pretty good at that. And I really wanted to stop there. I really did. But I had to be reminded that I'm a pretty good yes, but person, too. That we have not come so far from that we don't practice the yes, but syndrome anymore. In fact, the church is pretty good at the yes, but syndrome. And I know there won't be an amen after that, but I hope it settles in on you. The church, I'm not just talking about Madison Christian Church, I'm talking about the church. is pretty good as an institution at the yes but syndrome. We move forward in time into new ways of living in society and culture, and the church says, yes, but if we could just go back there, to how it was when all we had to do was open the doors and people would rush in. If we could just go back to when we had too many kids that we didn't know what to do with them. Let's just go back there. What we find in the Exodus story, I think, that really might be informative for us is that God doesn't do backward. God is going to provide. But God is going to provide for something new in every generation, in every people that come. But that something is going to be unfamiliar and maybe uncomfortable and scary. And so we, like the Israelites, have a tendency to say, let's go back, because it would be better back then. But the problem with the saying, let's go back, is that we do it with rose-colored glasses, because that's the way we view the going back. Our memory has a way of playing tricks that make us colorblind, if you will. And we remember all of the good things about going back, and we have a way of forgetting the struggle that was there in that time, that was very real and present. And so the Exodus teaches us, I think, it has something to say to the church. With God, time is not the way we counted it. It's not a circle. We start in January and we go around the calendar and we come back to January. And we start at midnight and we go around the clock and we come back to midnight. But God's time doesn't just do that. There's an arc to God's time that moves ever forward. God's direction in time moves in one way. Forward to the promise of the future. So the Israelites wrestle. They wrestle with following this unseen voice that calls out in the wilderness, providing the direction for their lives. And we wrestle also, don't we? We wrestle with God, a God whom we claim, but with whom we often struggle to understand. We wrestle with God, and sometimes that wrestling comes out as complaining and whining. And sometimes it comes out as a demand that we know better how to get where we're going than God does. I had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. His youngest child, his daughter, is 8, and she's really good at whining. 8-year-olds are good at that. So she's honing her whining skills, and he told me that there was a day a few weeks ago when she was really whining, and he said to her, "When have you gotten anything that you ever wanted by whining?" But he confessed to me that he knew the answer was a whole lot more at times than he wanted it to be. And he wondered out loud, am I making a monster? Giving in to certain provisions because of whining. I know this about him. He's a great dad. And I know that his kids are not going to grow up to be selfish brats, that he is giving them what they need in order to grow. And sometimes he might feel like that's giving in. But I know what he's giving them is the provision they need. And yes, he responds to their cries. That's what he does. But we can read it in this story of the Exodus and even beyond, all throughout Scripture. A rhythm where God's people cry out and God answers. And God provides. But it's not just a provision it's not just like a giving in to some dream wish. I'm just not going to be a genie and fulfill whatever wish you have. God is giving them and giving us what we need. And we find that in the Exodus story, what God gives sustains. And it offers growth. So that God can lead the people and they can be strong enough to move forward and reach the goal that God has for them. There's a rhythm, it seems to me, of redemption. That narrative shows us that crying out and God answering. Jesus says at the beginning of his ministry in Luke's gospel, he says, I have come to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. I wonder if somehow that's maybe related to rose-colored glasses sometimes. Recovery of true sight to those of us who've lost our way. I've come to let the oppressed go free. And so it is freedom that God moves us toward, and it is freedom that we struggle for in our own lives. And freedom sounds so good, doesn't it? Freedom sounds great until you are free. And sometimes when you get free, what you find out is that you've been so bound up by the past that you have forgotten how to make good choices. You don't know what to do or where to turn, and you realize that freedom is tricky. And maybe it requires guidance. Sometimes you forget that, but God doesn't forget. So God provides for your daily needs, and God gives guidance for your life, and God promises to help you move forward if you just stick with God's plan. God promises the growth that you need in the moment. And God gives more than anything that could ever be accomplished by going back. What God gives is not just wish fulfillment. And so the relationship that we build with God is one that will sustain us. Not just now, but into the future as well. I can't count for you the number of times that Tim and I have had an argument about how to get to the place that we are going. We don't do directions the same way. I will call him sometimes and say, where are you? And he'll say, mile marker 310. Oh, I just want to pull my hair out. It infuriates me. I do not know where mile marker 310 is. But if you say to me, I'm at the McDonald's on the last exit north in Coleman heading toward Huntsville, I know exactly where you are. We don't do directions the same. And so, we'll have arguments in the car. Turn here. No, it's down there. No, turn here. And then we end up not talking to each other for a while. But you know what? I really and truly have observed that Celia and Eli do not have this dynamic when they are going somewhere. Because they listen to that voice, that unseen voice. And even if it takes them a few miles or a few minutes or 40 years out of the way, they trust that eventually they will get to their destination. If only trusting God were as easy as that, right? If only. And yeah, before I forget, the Israelites, they finally do make it, all through that wandering desert wilderness area. They make it. A few books later in Joshua, we find out they make it, and you know how they get into Canaan, into the promised land? They get in the same way God got them out. The waters of the river are parted in the Jordan, and they walk across on dry land. But that is not nearly the end of the story. Because even in the land of God's promise, in the land of Canaan, with God's law to guide them and the kingdom that they have been promised by God's hand, they will forget because their memory is short. They will forget where it came from. And they will do things their own way. And they will discover what maybe some of us already know. That will lead them to exile. But that comes later. Another week. But until then, maybe you could hear, like I can hear, that voice. Recalculating. for that is God's voice. Let us follow.